Chapter 16. Arthur materialized, and did so with all the customary staggering about and clasping at his throat, heart, and various limbs that he still indulged himself in whenever he made one of these hateful and painful materializations that he was determined not to let himself get used to. He looked around for the others. They weren't there. He looked around for the others again. They still weren't there. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He looked around for the others. They obstinately persisted in their absence. He closed his eyes again, preparatory to making this completely futile exercise once more. And because it was only then, while his eyes were closed, that his brain began to register what his eyes had been looking at while they were open, a puzzled frown crept across his face. So he opened his eyes again to check his facts, and the frown stayed put. If anything, it intensified and got a good firm grip. If this was a party, it was a very bad one. So bad, in fact, that everyone else had left. It was a cave, or a labyrinth, or a tunnel, or something. There was insufficient light to tell, certainly insufficient light to hold a party in. All was darkness, a damp, shiny darkness. And there was no sound, no noise at all, except for the echoes of his own breathing, which sounded worried. And the more he listened to them, the more worried they began to sound. He coughed very slightly in an introductory sort of way. Then he had to listen to the thin, ghostly echo of his cough trailing off among winding corridors and sightless chambers, as of some great labyrinth, eventually returning to him via further unseen corridors, as if to say, "Yes?" This happened to every noise he made, and it unnerved him. He tried to hum a cheery tune. By the time it returned to him, it was a hollow dirge, and he stopped. His mind was suddenly full of images from the story that Slarty Bartfast had been telling him. He half expected suddenly to see lethal white robots step silently from the shadows and kill him. He caught his breath. They didn't. He let it go again. He didn't know what he did expect. Someone or something, however, seemed to be expecting him, for at that moment there lit up suddenly in the dark distance an eerie green neon sign. It said silently, "You have been diverted." The sign flicked off again, in a way that Arthur was not at all certain he liked. It flicked off with a sort of contemptuous flourish. Arthur then tried to assure himself that this was just a ridiculous trick of his imagination. A neon sign is either on or off, depending on whether it has electricity running through it or not. There was no way, he told himself, that it could possibly affect the transition from one state to the other with a contemptuous flourish. He hugged himself tightly in his dressing gown and shivered, nevertheless. The neon sign in the depths now suddenly lit up, bafflingly, with just 3 dots and a comma, like this, ... comma, only in green neon. It was trying, Arthur realized after staring at this perplexedly for a second or two, to indicate that there was more to come, that the sentence was not complete. Trying with almost superhuman pedantry, he further reflected, or at least non-human pedantry. The sentence then completed itself with these 2 words, Arthur Dent. He reeled. He steadied himself to have another clear look at it. It still said Arthur Dent, so he reeled again. Once again, the sign flicked off and left him blinking in the darkness with just the dim red image of his name jumping on his retina. Welcome, the sign now suddenly said. After a moment, it added, I don't think. The stone-cold fear which had been hovering around Arthur all this time, waiting for its moment, recognized that its moment had now come and pounced on him. He tried to fight it off. He dropped into a kind of alert crouch that he had once seen somebody do on television, but it must have been somebody with stronger knees. He peered huntedly into the darkness. Hello? He said. He cleared his throat and said it again, more loudly, without the At some distance down the corridor, it seemed suddenly as if somebody started to beat on a bass drum. He listened to it for a few seconds and realized that it was just his heart beating. He listened for a few seconds more and realized that it wasn't his heart. It was somebody down the corridor beating on a bass drum. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, tensed themselves, and leaped off. He put out a hand onto the floor to steady his alert crouch, which wasn't holding up very well. The sign changed itself again. It said, "Do not be alarmed." After a pause, it added, "Be very, very frightened, Arthur Dent." Once again it flicked off. Once again it left him in darkness. His eyes seemed to be popping out of his head. He wasn't certain if this was because they were trying to see more clearly, or if they simply wanted to leave at this point. "Hello?" he said again, this time trying to put a note of rugged and aggressive self-assertion in it. "Is anyone there?" There was no reply. Nothing. This unnerved Arthur even more than a reply would have done, and he began to back away from the scary nothingness. And the more he backed away, the more scared he became. After a while, he realized that the reason for this was that in all the films he had seen in which the hero backs further and further away from some imagined terror in front of him, he then manages to bump into it coming up from behind. At this point, it suddenly occurred to him to turn around rather quickly. There was nothing there, just blackness. This really unnerved him, and he started to back away from that, back the way he had come. After doing this for a short while, it suddenly occurred to him that he was now backing toward whatever it was he had been backing away from in the first place. This, he couldn't help thinking, must be a foolish thing to do. He decided he would be better off backing the way he had first been backing and turn around again. It turned out at this point that the second impulse had been the correct one, because there was an indescribably hideous monster standing quietly behind him. Arthur yawed wildly as his skin tried to jump one way and his skeleton the other, while his brain tried to work out which of his ears it most wanted to crawl out of. "Bet you weren't expecting to see me again," said the monster, which Arthur couldn't help thinking was a strange remark to make, seeing that he had never met the creature before. He could tell that he hadn't met the creature before from the simple fact that he was able to sleep nights. It was... It was... It was... Arthur blinked at it. It stood very still. It did look a little familiar. A terrible cold calm came over him as he realized what he was looking at was a 6-foot-high hologram of a housefly. He wondered why anybody would be showing him a 6-foot-high hologram of a housefly at this time. He wondered whose voice he had heard. It was a terribly realistic hologram. It vanished. "Or perhaps you remember me better," said the voice suddenly, and it was a deep, hollow, malevolent voice that sounded like molten tar slurping out of a drum with evil on its mind, as the rabbit. The sudden ping, there was a rabbit there in the black labyrinth with him, a huge, monstrously, hideously soft and lovable rabbit. An image again, but one on which every single soft and lovable hair seemed like a real and single thing growing in its soft and lovable coat. Arthur was startled to see his own reflection in the soft and lovable, unblinking, and extremely huge brown eye. "Born in darkness," rumbled the voice, "raised in darkness. One morning I poked my head for the first time into the bright new world and got it split open by what felt like some primitive instrument made of flint. Made by you, Arthur Dent, and wielded by you. Rather hard, as I recall. You turned my skin into a bag for keeping interesting stones in. I happen to know that because in my next life I came back as a fly again, and you swatted me. Again. Only this time you swatted me with the bag you'd made of my previous skin. Arthur Dent, you were not merely a cruel and heartless man, you were also staggeringly tactless." The voice paused while Arthur gawked. "I see you've lost the bag," said the voice. "Probably got bored with it, didn't you?" Arthur shook his head helplessly. He wanted to explain that he had been, in fact, very fond of the bag and had looked after it very well and had taken it with him wherever he went, but that somehow every time he traveled anywhere he seemed inexplicably to end up with the wrong bag. And that, curiously enough, even as they stood there, he was just noticing for the first time that the bag he had with him at the moment appeared to be made out of a rather nasty fake leopard skin. It wasn't the one he'd had a few minutes ago when he arrived at this place, whatever it was. It wasn't the one he would have chosen for himself, and heaven knew what would be in it if it wasn't his. And he would much rather have his original bag back, except that he was, of course, terribly sorry for having so peremptorily removed it, or rather its component parts, i.e. the rabbit skin, from the previous owner, viz. The rabbit, whom he currently had the honor of attempting vainly to address. All he actually managed to say was, "Er, meet the newt you trod on," said the voice. And there was, standing in the corridor with Arthur, a great green scaly newt. Arthur turned, yelped, leaped backward, found himself standing in the middle of the rabbit. He yelped again, but he could find nowhere to leap to. "That was me too," continued the voice in a low, menacing rumble, "as if you didn't know." "No?" said Arthur with a start. "No?" "The interesting thing about reincarnation," rasped the voice, "is that most people, most spirits, are not aware that it is happening to them." He paused for effect. As far as Arthur was concerned, there was already quite enough effect going on. "I was aware," hissed the voice. "That is, I became aware. Slowly, gradually." He, whoever he was, paused again and gathered breath. "I could hardly help it, could I?" he bellowed. And the same thing kept happening over and over and over again. Every life I ever lived, I got killed by Arthur Dent. Any world, any body, any time. I'm just getting settled down. Along comes Arthur Dent. Pow! He kills me. Hard not to notice. Bit of a memory jogger. Bit of a pointer. Bit of a bloody giveaway. "That's funny," my spirit would say to itself as it winged its way back to the netherworld after another fruitless, dent-ended venture into the land of the living. "That man who just ran me over as I was hopping across the road to my favorite pond looked a little familiar." And gradually I got to piece it together. "Dent, you multiple me murderer." The echoes of his voice roared up and down the corridors. Arthur stood silent and cold, his head shaking with disbelief. "Here's the moment, Dent," shrieked the voice, now reaching a feverish pitch of hatred. "Here's the moment when I at last knew." It was indescribably hideous, the thing that suddenly opened up in front of Arthur, making him gasp and gargle with horror. But here's an attempt at a description of how hideous it was. It was a huge, palpitating, wet cave with vast, slimy, rough, whale-like creature rolling around in it and sliding over monstrous white tombstones. High above the cave rose a vast promontory from which could be seen the dark recesses of two further fearful caves, which Arthur didn't suddenly realize that he was looking at his own mouth. His attention was meant to be directed at the live oyster that was being tipped helplessly into it. He staggered back with a cry and averted his eyes. When he looked again, the appalling apparition had gone. The corridor was dark and briefly silent. He was alone with his thoughts. They were extremely unpleasant thoughts, and he would rather have had a chaperone. The next noise, when it came, was the low, heavy roll of a large section of a wall trundling aside, revealing, for the moment, just a dark blankness behind it. Arthur looked into it much the same way that a mouse looks into a dark dog kennel. And then the voice spoke to him again. "Tell me it was a coincidence, Dent," it said. "I dare you to tell me it was a coincidence." "It was a coincidence," said Arthur quickly. "It was not," came the answering bellow. "It was," said Arthur. "It was." "If it was a coincidence, then my name," roared the voice, "is not Agrajag." "And presumably," said Arthur, "you would claim that that was your name?" "Yes," hissed Agrajag, as if he had just completed a rather deft syllogism. "Well, I'm afraid it was still a coincidence," said Arthur. "Come in here and say that," howled the voice, in sudden apoplexy again. Arthur walked in and said that it was a coincidence, or at least he nearly said it was a coincidence. His tongue rather lost its footing toward the end of the last word, because the lights came up and revealed what it was he had walked into. It was a cathedral of hate. It was the product of a mind that was not merely twisted, but actually sprained. It was huge. It was horrific. It had a statue in it. We will come to the statue in a moment. The vast, incomprehensibly vast chamber looked as if it had been carved out of the inside of a mountain. And the reason for this was precisely that was what it had been carved out of. It seemed to Arthur to spin sickeningly round his head as he stood and gaped at it. It was black. Where it wasn't black, you were inclined to wish that it was, because the colors with which some of the unspeakable details were picked out ranged horribly across the whole spectrum of eye-defying colors. From ultraviolet to infrared, taking in liver purple, loathsome lilac, madder yellow, burnt ombre, and gangrene on the way. The unspeakable details that those colors picked out were the gargoyles that would have put Francis Bacon off his lunch. The gargoyles all looked inward from the walls, from the pillars, from the flying buttresses, from the choir stalls, towards the statue, to which we will come in a moment. And if the gargoyles would have put Francis Bacon off his lunch, then it was clear from the gargoyles' faces that the statue would have put them off theirs, had they been alive to eat it, which they weren't, and if anybody had tried to serve them some, which they wouldn't. Around the monumental walls were vast engraved stone tablets in memory of those who had fallen to Arthur Dent. The names of some of those commemorated were underlined and had asterisks against them. So, for instance, the name of the cow that had been slaughtered, and of which Arthur had happened to eat a fillet steak, would have been the plainest engraving, whereas the name of a fish that Arthur himself had caught and then decided he didn't like and left on the side of the plate had a double underlining, 3 sets of asterisks, and a bleeding dagger added this decoration, just to make the point. And what was most disturbing about all this, apart from the statue, to which we are, by degrees, coming, was the very clear implication that these people and creatures were indeed the same person, over and over again. And it was equally clear that this person was, however unfairly, extremely upset and annoyed. In fact, it would have been fair to say that he had reached a level of annoyance the like of which had never been seen in the universe. It was an annoyance of epic proportions, a burning, searing flame of annoyance, an annoyance that now spanned the whole of time and space in its infinite umbrage. This annoyance had been given its fullest expression in the statue at the center of all this monstrosity that was a statue of Arthur Dent, and an unflattering one. 50 feet tall, if it was an inch, there's not an inch of it that wasn't crammed with insult to its subject matter, and 50 feet of that sort of thing would have been enough to make any subject feel bad. From the small pimple on the side of his nose to the poorish cut of his dressing gown, there was no aspect of Arthur Dent that wasn't lambasted and vilified by the sculptor. Arthur appeared as a gorgon, an evil, rapacious, ravening, bloodied ogre, fluttering his way through an innocent one-man universe. With each of the 30 arms that the sculptor, in a fit of artistic fervor, had decided to give them, he was either braining a rabbit, swatting a fly, pulling a wishbone, picking a flea out of his hair, or doing something that Arthur at first look couldn't quite identify. His many feet were mostly stamping on ants. Arthur put his hands over his eyes, hung his head, and shook it slowly from side to side in sadness and horror at the craziness of things. And when he opened his eyes again, there in front of him stood the figure of a man or creature or whatever it was that he had supposedly been persecuting all this time. "Ha!" said Agrajag. He, or whatever, looked like a mad fat bat. He waddled slowly around Arthur and poked him with bent claws. "Look," protested Arthur. "Hurrah!" explained Agrajag, and Arthur reluctantly accepted this on the grounds that he was rather frightened by this hideous and strangely wrapped apparition. Agrajag was black, bloated, wrinkled, and leathery. His bat wings were somehow more frightening for being the pathetic, broken, floundering things they were than if they had been strong, muscular beaters of the air. The most frightening thing was probably the tenacity of his continued existence against all the physical odds. He had the most astounding collection of teeth. They looked as if each had come from a completely different animal, and they were ranged around his mouth at such bizarre angles that it seemed that if he ever actually tried to chew anything, he'd lacerate half of his own face along with it, and possibly put out an eye as well. Each of his 3 eyes was small and intense and looked about as sane as a fish in a privet bush. I was at a cricket match, he rasped. This seemed on the face of it such a preposterous notion that Arthur practically choked. Not in this body, screeched the creature. Not in this body. This is my last body, my last life. This is my revenge body, my kill Arthur Dent body, my last chance. I had to fight to get it, too. But I was, roared Agrajag, at a cricket match. I had a weak heart condition. But what, I said to my wife, can happen to me at a cricket match? As I'm watching, what happens? Two people quite maliciously appear out of thin air just in front of me. The last thing I can't help but notice before my poor heart gives out in shock is that one of them is Arthur Dent wearing a rabbit bone in his beard. Coincidence? Yes, said Arthur. Coincidence? Screamed the creature, painfully thrashing its broken wings and opening a short gash on its right cheek with a particularly nasty tooth. On closer examination, such as he'd been hoping to avoid, Arthur noticed that much of Agrajag's face was covered with ragged strips of black band-aids. He backed away nervously. He tugged at his beard. He was appalled to discover that, in fact, he still had the rabbit bone in it. He pulled it out and threw it away. Look, he said, it's just fate playing silly buggers with you, with me, with us. It's a complete coincidence. What have you got against me, Dent? Snarled the creature, advancing on him in a painful waddle. Nothing, insisted Arthur. Honestly, nothing. Agrajag fixed him with a beady stare. Seems a strange way to relate to somebody you've got nothing against, killing them all the time. Very curious piece of social interaction, I would call that. I'd also call it a lie. But look, said Arthur, I'm very sorry. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I've got to go. Have you got a clock? I'm meant to be helping save the universe. He backed away still farther. Agrajag advanced still farther. At one point, he hissed. At one point, I decided to give up. Yes, I would not come back. I would stay in another world. And what happened? Arthur indicated with random shakes of his head that he had no idea and didn't want to have one either. He found he had backed up against the cold, dark stone that had been carved by who knew what Herculean effort into a monstrous travesty of his bedroom slippers. He glanced up at his own horrendously parodied image towering above him. He was still puzzled as to what one of his hands was meant to be doing. I got yanked involuntarily back into the physical world, pursued Agrajag, as a bunch of petunias. In, I might add, a bowl. This particular happy little lifetime started off with me, in my bowl, unsupported, 300 miles above the surface of a particularly grim planet. Not a naturally tenable position for a bowl of petunias, you might think. And you'd be right. That life ended a very short while later, 300 miles lower. In, I might add, the fresh wreckage of a whale, my spirit brother. He leered at Arthur with renewed hatred. Sorry, lost my page. On the way down, he snarled, I couldn't help noticing a flashy-looking white spaceship. Looking out of a port on this flashy-looking spaceship was a smug-looking Arthur Dent. Coincidence? Yes, yelped Arthur. He glanced up again and realized that the arm that had puzzled him was represented as wantonly calling into existence a bowl of doomed petunias. This was not a concept that leaped easily to the eye. I must go, insisted Arthur. You may go, said Agrajag, after I have killed you. No, that won't be any use, explained Arthur, beginning to climb up the hard stone incline of his carved bedroom slipper. Because I have to save the universe, you see. I have to find a silver bale. That's the point. Tricky thing to do, Dad. Save the universe, spat Agrajag with contempt. You should have thought of that before you started your vendetta against me. What about the time when you were on Stravomula Beta and someone, I've never been there, said Arthur, tried to assassinate you and you ducked? Who do you think the bullet hit? What did you say? Never been there, repeated Arthur. What are you talking about? I have to go. Agrajag stopped in his tracks. You must have been there. You were responsible for my death there, as everywhere else. An innocent bystander, he quivered. I've never heard of the place, insisted Arthur. Certainly never had anyone try to assassinate me, other than you. Perhaps I go there later, do you think? Agrajag blinked slowly in a kind of frozen logical horror. You haven't been to Stavromula Beta yet? He whispered. No, said Arthur. I don't know anything about the place. Certainly never been to it and don't have any plans to go. Oh, you go there, all right, muttered Agrajag in a broken voice. You go there, all right. Zark! He tottered and stared wildly about him at his huge cathedral of hate. I've brought you here too soon. He started to scream and bellow. I've brought you here too zarking soon. Suddenly he rallied and turned a baleful, hating eye on Arthur. I'm going to kill you anyway, he roared. Even if it's a logical impossibility, I'm going to zark and we'll try. I'm going to blow this whole mountain up, he screamed. Let's see you get out of this one, Dent. He rushed in a painful, waddling hobble to what appeared to be a small, black sacrificial altar. He was shouting so wildly now that he was really carving his face up badly. Arthur leaped down from his vantage place on the carving with his own foot and ran to try to restrain the three-quarters crazed creature. He leaped upon him and brought the strange monstrosity crashing down on top of the altar. Agrajag screamed again, thrashing wildly for a brief moment, and turned a wild eye on Arthur. You know what you've done? He gurgled painfully. You've gone and killed me again. I mean, what do you want from me, blood? He thrashed again in a brief apoplectic fit, quivered and collapsed, smacking a large red button on the altar as he did so. Arthur started with horror and fear, first at what he had appeared to have done, then at the loud sirens and bells that suddenly shouted in the air to announce some clamoring emergency. He stared wildly around him. The only exit appeared to be the way he had come in. He pelted toward it, throwing away the nasty fake leopard bag skin bag as he did so. He dashed randomly, haphazardly through the labyrinthine maze. He seemed to be pursued more and more fiercely by klaxons, sirens, flashing lights. Suddenly, he turned a corner and there was a light in front of him. It wasn't flashing. It was daylight. Chapter 17. Although it has been said that on Earth alone in our galaxy is cricket, or cricket spelled differently, treated as a fit subject for a game, and that for this reason the Earth has been shunned. This only applies to our galaxy, and more specifically to our dimension. In some of the higher dimensions, they feel they can more or less please themselves. They've been playing a particular game called Brockian Ultra Cricket, for whatever their transdimensional equivalent of 1 billion years is. Let's be blunt, it's a nasty game, says the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But then anyone who's been to any of the higher dimensions will know that they're a pretty nasty heathen lot up there who should just be smashed and done in, and would be too if anyone could work out a way of firing missiles at right angles to reality. This is another example that the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will employ anybody who wants to walk straight in off the street and get ripped off, especially if they happen to walk in off the streets during the afternoon, when very few of the regular staff members are there. There is a fundamental point here. The history of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one of idealism, struggle, despair, passion, success, failure, and enormously long lunch breaks. The earliest origins of the guide are now, along with most of its financial records, lost in the mists of time. For other and more curious theories about where they are lost, see below. Hurling Fruitmig, it is said, founded the guide, established its fundamental principles of honesty and idealism, and went bust. There followed many years of penury and heart-searching during which he consulted friends, sat in darkened rooms in illegal states of mind, thought about this and that, fooled about with weights, and then, after a chance encounter with the holy lunching friars of Undun, who claimed that just as lunch was the center of a man's temporal day, and a man's temporal day could be seen in this analogy for his spiritual life, so lunch should be A, seen as the center of a man's spiritual life, and B, held in jolly nice restaurants. He refounded the guide, laid down its fundamental principles of honesty and idealism and where you could stuff them both, and led the guide on its first commercial success. He also started to develop and explore the role of the editorial lunch break that was subsequently to play such a crucial part in the guide's history, since it meant that most of the actual work got done by any passing stranger who happened to wander into the empty offices in an afternoon and saw something worth doing. Shortly after this, the guide was taken over by Mega Dodo Publications of Ursa Minor Beta, thus putting the whole thing on very sound financial footing, allowing the fourth editor, Lig Lurie Jr., to embark on lunch breaks of such breathtaking scope that even the efforts of recent editors who started undertaking sponsored lunch breaks for charity seem like mere sandwiches in comparison. In fact, Lig never formally resigned his editorship. He merely left his office late one morning and has never returned since. Though well over a century has now passed, many members of the guide staff still retain the romantic notion that he has simply popped out for a sandwich, will yet return to put in a solid afternoon's work. Strictly speaking, all editors since Lig Lurie Jr. have therefore been designated acting editors, and Lig's desk is still preserved the way he left it, with the addition of a small sign that says Lig Lurie Jr., editor, missing, presumed fed. Some very scurrilous and subversive sources hint at the idea that Lig actually perished in the guide's first extraordinary experiments in alternative bookkeeping. Very little is known of this, and less still said. Anyone who even notices, let alone calls attention to the curious, but utterly coincidental and meaningless fact that every world on which the guide has ever set up an accounting department has shortly afterward perished in warfare or some natural disaster, is liable to get sued to smithereens. It is an interesting, though utterly unrelated fact, that the 2 or 3 days prior to the demolition of the planet Earth to make way for a new hyperspace bypass saw a dramatic upsurge in the number of UFO sightings there, not only above the Lord's cricket ground in St. John's Wood, London, but also above Glastonbury in Somerset. Glastonbury has long been associated with myths of ancient kings, witchcraft, and wart curing, and now has been selected as the site of the guide's new financial records office. And indeed, 10 years' worth of financial records were transferred to a magic hill just outside the city mere hours before the Vogons arrived. None of these facts, however strange and inexplicable, is as strange or inexplicable as the rules of the game of Brocchian ultra cricket, as played in the higher dimensions. A full set of rules is so massively complicated that the only time they were all bound together in a single volume, they underwent gravitational collapse and became a black hole. A brief summary, however, follows. Rule 1, grow at least 3 extra legs. You won't need them, but it helps keep the crowds amused. Rule 2, find one extremely good Brocchian ultra cricket player. Clone him off a few times. This saves an enormous amount of tedious selecting and training. Rule 3, put your team and the opposing team in a large field and build a high wall around them. The reason for this is that, though the game is a major spectator sport, the frustration experienced by the audience at not actually being able to see what's going on leads them to imagine that it's a lot more exciting than it actually is. A crowd that has just watched a rather humdrum game experiences far less life affirmation than a crowd that believes it just missed the most dramatic event in sporting history. Rule 4, throw lots of assorted items of sporting equipment over the wall for the players. Anything will do. Cricket bats, base cube bats, tennis rackets, skis, anything you can get a good swing with. Rule 5, the players should now lay about themselves for all they are worth with whatever they find to hand. Whenever a player scores a hit on another player, he should immediately run away as fast as he can and apologize from a safe distance. Apologies should be concise, sincere, and for maximum clarity and points, delivered through a megaphone. Rule 6, the winning team shall be the first team that wins. Curiously enough, the more the obsession with the game grows in the higher dimensions, the less it is actually played, since most of the competing teams are now in a state of permanent warfare with each other over the interpretation of these rules. This is all for the best, Because in the long run, a good solid war is less psychologically damaging than a protracted game of Brockian ultra. The end.